All right, welcome to this week's Ronin seminar. This time we have Anamaria Berea, who is going to talk to us about communication in all its multifarious forms. Please go ahead, Anamaria.
Thank you, John. Indeed, my discussion today is a little bit different from the usual types of research, right, that we are doing about, let's say that we have a hypothesis, and as scientists, we use different methods to test it, and then we present the results. The talk I'm giving today is more about exploratory research and more about why we should or why it would be useful to build an atlas of communication, why it would be useful to look at communication differently than it has done before, and what can we achieve from this. Particularly in the talk today, I am going to outline the role that data science or the newest methodologies that have been developed lately in computational techniques, how they can help unify this seemingly different and disparate field of study. And to begin, communication is ubiquitous, is basically as ubiquitous as information. But while there is an integrated scientific discipline for information science, where we have theories and applications, we don't really have an integrated scientific discipline for communication science, where we would study not only local patterns or observations of human communication. When we are talking about communication right now, people usually think about business communication or communication between professionals or communications within family, between parents and children. And then in, let's say in the field of biology, the scientists are looking at communication at different species, right? They are specialized in a particular species and they are looking at how communication happens in that particular species. This disparate information that we have about communication, we can perhaps put it together and look and seek to see whether there are some universal patterns, some global patterns of communication that we can identify and basically look at, okay, what is the role of communication in life on Earth in general, from cells to societies. And we cannot begin looking at this very, very broad field of study or very, very broad exploratory research without looking a little bit at epistemology or to try to understand where knowledge comes from. I'm looking here, okay, what if we are looking at communication as a posteriori knowledge, right? So there is an a posteriori epistemology where just like I was mentioning in the beginning, we are used with the scientific method where we are testing hypotheses and we are presenting different results. So this is how we have been discovering knowledge or how we have been creating knowledge in science in general, using a posteriori knowledge, which is mostly, not entirely, but mostly about empirical evidence. So we collect evidence and from there, using scientific methods, we construct knowledge. The idea is that we know more or less how physical systems work. We know more or less how biological systems work, and we know more or less how civilization and economic systems work. Of course, with different degrees, and there are still many unknowns. So I'm making some really broad assertions here, but we also know that biological laws do not violate physical laws, right? Cellular laws do not violate atomic laws, right? So we are building up from what we understand from physics, we are building up then what we understand into biology, and from what we understand in biology, we build up into an understanding of how our own civilization works based on not just biological laws, right? As humans in our social systems, we do not violate biological laws, but we add some social laws to it. So the idea here is if we have this kind of branching and hierarchical thread of laws from physics to biology to some economic laws of civilization, does it mean that we actually have more variation in laws than that has happened in time, and in time, in let's say in evolutionary time, right, since the beginning of times? And also how many of these laws are local, right? Because Again, cellular laws do not apply to atoms laws, but atoms laws do apply to the cellular laws, right? So we have encompassing but not overlapping sets over there, right? So does this mean that we actually have more variation into local laws that are specific to biological systems or social systems, right, than global laws, right? So the idea here is that communication is life dependent and intelligent communication is civilization dependent. We can make these assertions, but if we are looking indeed for some universal markers or for some universal patterns of communication, then the idea here is, should we pay closer attention to how these global laws have developed into more local laws? Then, of course, we don't have knowledge that comes only from scientific knowledge. We also have a priori knowledge. And we have knowledge that comes from empathy, from beliefs, from emotions, and from symbolism, from different symbols. This knowledge is highly subjective, is highly intrinsic, yet we can communicate with it, right? So every time we are looking at a work of art, at a piece of art, say at a painting, most of us will get the same general feeling, although each of us will look at it in a different way, right? So if you see here, if you look at painting from Salvador Dali or from a drawing from Escher, each of us will get a different understanding, yet there is something general and universal in our human subjective understanding in the way we internally understand, again, these emotions or these symbols, or we develop similar beliefs. But then there is also the idea of communication as a complex system, right? So, and this is the idea that I like the most, because communication is a phenomenon that is so broad and touches on so many aspects of our life that are not, like I was mentioning, it's not knowledge that comes just from science. And it's also non-linear, and it's also emergent, and it displays near decomposability, meaning that it's not like a watch or like a car that you can take it apart in pieces and then put it together. It's also, there is a lot of self-organization when it comes to communication, and there is a lot of adaptation when it comes to communication, and the human languages are probably the best example for these. Again, looking at epistemological systems, Jean Piaget was the founder of what is called genetic epistemology, where he's basically asserting that scientific knowledge is in perpetual evolution, that it finds itself changed from one day to the next. And I do think that's what's happening in science in general, right? We discover new knowledge, or we discovered that some previous knowledge that we had was incorrect, and then we also have our different cultural biases or our different personal beliefs that come into the way we approach phenomena, trying to understand phenomena. So there are definitely some coevolutionary patterns here. If we're looking at this broad phenomenon of communication from this perspective, then there are physical systems of communication. We can look at logical, mathematical systems of communication, which are also human constructs, and we can look at social systems of communication, which come from interactions in groups and within groups. Like, for example, when I'm talking about physical communication, how did our speech, for instance, evolve, and because our biology has evolved. When we are looking at logical mathematical communication, again, how did different branches of mathematics evolve because our social and economic context has evolved? Like, let's say we are looking now a huge trend in mathematics, in mathematical sciences and in statistics is called data science, right? Because our social and economic environment needs more let's say, data analysis or data architectures to cope with or to harvest knowledge from the new computational and digital systems that we have now. And of course, we have social knowledge from our interactions, and we can look at social knowledge both when it comes to the spread of beliefs of what we like or don't like, or even when it comes to fashion or some very transitory phenomenon. And if we are looking at communication from this perspective, we have to keep in mind that it relies on the idea of information and how do we exchange information. And when we are talking about information, there are also means and meanings in information. And Claude Shannon's famous formula for entropy, which you can see here on the left, was basically foundational for the idea of bit and for transmitting information in digital systems, right? But the information that is being transmitted in these kind of systems is completely devoid of meaning, right? We are transmitting ones and zeros, and what comes from one end or the other from the sender or receiver is up to their own interpretation. On another hand, when we are looking at the meaning of information, let's say, for example, the field of semiotics is the field that is completely focused on finding or trying to understand how information is being interpreted in different situations or by different agents. And if you can look at this example from the different versions of the same painting of Vincent van Gogh, Bedroom in Arles. Vincent van Gogh was notorious for making several versions of the same painting because he couldn't find the same. He was trying to find a very, very specific, to convey a very, very specific feeling. And that's why he had so many versions of the same painting. And for each of these versions, we can either interpret it on our own, either as the same, we see the same thing, or maybe each of these versions conveys a different meaning for some of us. And the idea of means and meaning of information is important because if we are focused only on the way we are transmitting information, then a large informational context about the information that is being transmitted is being lost. So for instance, if you're looking at these two paintings, actually only one of them was painted by Mondrian, and the other one was painted by an artificial intelligence algorithm, looking, being trained on the previous composition themes from Mondrian. Mondrian, he painted several paintings named Composition in the same style, as you can see on the left. The one on the left is the painting painted by Mondrian, and the one on the right is the painting painted by the artificial intelligence algorithm. But this doesn't mean if the algorithm rendered a painting that is in the similar tone and style as Mondrian's composition, does it convey or can it interpret the meaning of what it has done, right? Of what of the painting that he or she, right, or it basically has painted. Another idea that is important to keep in mind when we are talking about communication, besides the idea of means and meaning of information, is the idea of natural versus artefactual communication, which is also specific for complex systems. For example, the picture on the left is a map where it represents the brain of a mouse, while the picture on the right represents the internet on our globe, and which is displayed and visualized in a nice way here, which does not overlay with the geography of Earth, but with clusters of information, right? So if we are looking at different scales, right, the brain of a mouse versus the internet, which are both systems of communication, the brain of the mouse is mostly communicating using natural communication, using chemical communication, using the synapses, while the internet is a system of communication where communication is done digitally through zeros and ones, and again based on the equation that was laid out by Claude Shannon in the 40s. But when we are talking about combining or looking at common patterns in natural and artefactual communication, we also need to look at different phase transitions, because as a complex system, we are also facing a system that has scales, right? Where communication happens from gene to gene interaction all the way to major financial or transportation systems, right, from cells to societies. And then if we are looking at the scalability of this type of phenomenon, then we definitely need to look at some phase transitions, or how do these systems scale up. And another area where we need to look at is the coevolution of these systems, because in human languages, for instance, we are dealing with both natural and artefactual communication. When we are talking to each other, we are using sound and vision as natural ways of communication, but we are also using signs, or we are using writing. And those are examples of artefactual communication. I believe that only humans on our planet have so far developed artefactual means of communication. All the other living systems, including this highly social and cultural organisms like dolphins and whales, they are primarily using natural systems of communication. So what does it mean? What does this mean for us? It means that we can look at the evolution between small to big, or the scaling between small to big, also in terms of evolution in chronology, or time evolution. We are looking at how local patterns of communication have become global patterns of communication primarily to globalization. Due to globalization, the group size has increased, or the connectivity of the groups has increased, both in time and in space. We are looking at our history, our civilization history at large. Then technological innovations have definitely increased. Economic lifestyles, or the economic prosperity at large for our civilization has increased, let's say, since the antiquity until the modern times. Our way of displaying collective behaviors has increased. So there is an increase in diversity and also an increase in magnitude. This is what globalization has done for our civilization. And especially we have seen this accelerating in the past century or so. And basically, since the invention of writing in Mesopotamia, where we had the clay tablets, where these clay tablets were used for accounting, we had the economic development and artefactual means of communication being highly intertwined ever since, right? So we have developed the writing so that we can do better economics, let's say, in Mesopotamia. And then we have developed the telegraph, and then we have developed digital means of communication, and we spurred into accelerating into the information age. And also another important factor for the globalization of our world has been the spread of the English language. And we have to keep in mind that at one point, there were more than 60,000 languages on Earth. Right now, there are less than 7,000, and it is being predicted that within the next 30 to 50 years, there will only be one human language that is going to be left on Earth. So there is a globalization phenomenon or trend that is going on in human languages. So where we have a generalization of the way we are communicating. So from the Tower of Babel that you see on the left to, let's say, the spread of the maritime systems that you see on the right, we have come a very long way, and we have come in a way in which these localized patterns of communication have become global. When we are thinking about global patterns of communication, perhaps the best examples that we can see right now, besides the internet, are the transportation systems, the transportations and the financial systems, where both, let's say, for airlines and for maritime transportation, people or companies use the same language, and there is the same type of communication, right, that goes on over there, and it goes and it happens over the entire planet, basically, right? So those are major systems of communication. And this is important because these types of global communication that we are looking at right now, besides being harmonized in a way that everybody who uses them understands them, they are also based, or they create a lot of data, right? So this is where the idea of the age of data in our civilization comes in. The age of data in our civilization is mostly a result of two forces. One, this global spread of artefactual means of communication. It's quite ubiquitous and trivial right now to have human-computer interactions, digital systems. Everybody is speaking in English when it comes to business across the globe. And then the second one would be the global spread of physical systems of recording and storing communication. So we are not storing communication on cuneiform tokens anymore, as we did 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, but now we are storing everything on servers and supercomputers. This is data that is more about the means of information exchange. Now, if the means of information exchange have become global, as we can see here on the right, where again, that's a picture of the maritime traffic on Earth. But the meaning of information still remains, in many aspects, it remains local. And what do I mean by that? It means that when we are looking at different symbols, some symbols are more trivial or more ubiquitous than others. So if we are looking, for instance, at a Mandelbrot set, and we display this Mandelbrot set to several people, there are only a few people that will recognize it as a Mandelbrot set, and those would be the people that have some training in mathematics or in fractals, right? On the other hand, if we display this red cross, many more people will understand it, regardless of where they come from or where they are on Earth. And they will think of it as a hospital or a place where they can get help for their health or their physical condition, right? And another example is, okay, let's look at this plot, or which is the ISLM model from economics, which basically only economists will understand when they look at it. On the other hand, if we look at the symbol on the right, many more people will intuitively understand that this is the brand, major brand of a company. So basically when we are looking at trivial or daily systems of communication, in a way we are looking at patterns of communication that have survived, have adapted, and have spread for a wider population, right? That they are, in evolutionary terms, they are perhaps more successful than sophisticated means of communication. So while I outlined a few aspects of communication as a complex system, how can we bring this all together? So basically, let's build an atlas, right? So what is an atlas? It's a way of cataloging and of classifying a certain phenomenon, right? So an atlas is about mapping, right? So we can see the map of the universe, so we know what's out there. We have by direct observations. And mapping is all about topological and spatial relationships. Another characteristic of an atlas is phylogeny. And if we are looking at the phylogenetic tree of life, we have a better understanding about how life basically evolved on Earth and which are the main branches of the tree of life. And phylogeny is going to give us an idea about evolutionary and temporal relationships. And of course, an atlas is about taxonomy or classification or systematization. What is that we are looking at, and which are the relationships of interest over there? So again, if we are looking at the taxonomy of life, We have domains, we have kingdoms, we have phylum, we have classes, orders, families, and so on. So they branch down and they diversify. And as we have seen, the patterns of communication as a complex system, they have the same branching and evolutionary aspects as perhaps any other system that has been cataloged in atlas in an atlas before. And why or how would we be able to do this? That's where these new technologies or techniques that we have right now can certainly help. And graph networks, for instance, or graph theory are perfect for doing topological analysis. Machine learning techniques for performing time series analysis and learning, right? And then ontological discoveries techniques are very good at classification, and also some machine learning techniques are very good at classifying or doing ontological discovery. So we can use data science to create this atlas of communication by basically cataloging the data, aligning the data, and looking at the evidence that is out there. Now, of course, there is a lot of evidence, right? When we are talking about communication, it's so broad that probably a lifetime would not be enough. And this is certainly not the task that can be done by just one person. But on another hand, if we are looking at patterns and processes of communication, I think this we are reducing the space of studying this phenomenon in a meaningful way without losing important evidence. And of course, when we are looking at a phenomenon, we shouldn't look just for the positive aspect or why that phenomenon happens, how it happens, when and by whom, but also why not, or when that doesn't happen, or which are the boundary conditions for that phenomenon. But unlike any other phenomenon, when we are talking about communication and information, we have to keep in mind that actually miscommunication and false information is also information, right? So this is one of the specific characteristics for information. And that's why even more so, we should look at communication pathologies when there is miscommunication, and biologists know that there is a lot of miscommunication going on in intraspecies and interspecies communication, and those are very interesting facts that should be cataloged. And we also know from linguistic research or from genetic research or molecular biology research that when there is miscommunication or false information being transmitted, it's also where mutation and some mutations happen, and we have more variation and more diversity occurring, right? So we can have linguistic mutations and gene signaling mutations. And that's important to look at these boundaries when there is a non-occurrence of communication or of the phenomenon, because in this way we are creating or we are reducing the search space and the uncertainty for such a large and broad phenomenon that is under study. And just to give an example why this is important, so if we're looking at the at genes, right, at gene signaling, there have been many experiments done in gene signaling, and in this particular example, in this paper that was published in 2003, if you look at the plot on plot C on the right, it's when no communication happens, right? While in the other two plots, A and B, there is communication happening, A in the natural environment and B in a lab environment. So even in a proxy or simulated environment, communication happens, but when you don't have a specific chemical in this that is responsible for signaling, in this case it's called CAMP, then no communication happens, nothing happens. And also, if there are defects or mutations, as I was talking about communication pathologies, these can be corrected, right? So in this other experiment, in this other paper, the mutant genes were able to communicate by having the CAMP or the signal being artificially induced. Of course, in morphogenesis, we have cells that in the plot B below, you can see that when cells are being stimulated with more communication, with more signaling, with more CAMP signaling, then there is more communication going on. And I think there is no coincidence at all that Alan Turing, father of computing, right, that he was basically researching both information theory and morphogenesis at the same time. And I think this is in morphogenesis in molecular biology is a good place to start for creating such an atlas for communication. And some examples of how this can be achieved. For example, when in searching for exoplanets, how are technosignatures changing or disrupting biosignatures, right? Where are the some coevolutionary patterns there between biocommunication and technological communication that we know from Earth that we can also look at in other worlds? Then we can look at social and collective behavior laws as proxies for bio and technosignatures. As I was trying to show before, when we have more social interaction, more collective interaction, then we also have more globalization and we have more global communication going on. Then another interesting question to explore would be, can we extrapolate from empirical laws and from statistical regularities that we know from social and collective phenomena, such as the Moore law, for instance, into communication phenomena? Is there a Moore's law for communication? Could we apply the NK fitness model of Stuart Kaufman's from biology to the field of communication? Another example is when or where does noise become signal and signal becomes noise, right? So this is more into the field of computational semiotics. And can we create a bridge between semiotics and data science? Semiotics is looking again at meaning of different symbols, but it does not have the capability or didn't have the capability so far to do to quantify this or to model this, while on another hand, using data science, we have more evidence that we can perhaps apply to the study of meaning that semiotics has done for the past decades. And I call these methodological reversals because I think there shouldn't be only one certain type of methodology or one certain type of hypothesis testing or of doing scientific experiments that can be applied here. First, let's just collect what can be collected, right? And classify it. And then with an open mind, let's see if we can find something interesting and some of these universal markers. And to finish this talk, I'll finish it with probably what has been called many times the most beautiful symbol of them all, the symbol of infinity, that is simple and conveys the most of the information. And I'm looking forward for some questions. Thank you.
Yay!